And a little more than halfway down the page, this is Aristotle on rhetoric. He really did write the first important book on it. He says, if, however, it should be objected that he who uses unjustly the rhetorical power may injure others in a great degree, this objection is common to everything that is good, except virtue. It's a remarkable statement. What he's essentially saying is that anything that has power, anything that can be used for good, except virtue itself, can be used for ill. It's a power. Can military might be used for good? I think everyone except perhaps a pacifist would say yes, it can be. Can it be used for ill? Of course. Can energy itself be used for good, no matter what form it comes in? Sure. Can it be used for ill? Sure. Force, imagination, wealth, they all can be used for ill, but they all can be used for good. And this is what Aristotle is saying about rhetoric. And especially this is applied to the most useful things, such as strength, health, riches, and military command. So he's putting rhetoric in with those. In other words, if you attack rhetoric as being fundamentally unethical, you might as well attack all of those other things as being fundamentally unethical too. Because they're all a double-edged sword. One edge for good, one edge for bad. And we have talked earlier about the fact that rhetoric can be used for ill purposes. It's a very practical thing. If someone says to you, oh, you're taking a humanities course, it's not at all practical, is it? Tell them, no, it's very practical. There couldn't be anything more practical in the living world than being able to analyze and talk about things in language so that you might be able to make the world better. That seems to me to be a pretty practical undertaking, to learn how better to do that. It is likewise evident that the employment of rhetoric is not to persuade. This is in the last paragraph. This is remarkable, because everybody says, oh, rhetoric's just persuasion. But remember, John Quincy Adams says, no, it's not just persuasion. And Aristotle says, the employment of rhetoric is not to persuade. Well, it is, but he means not primarily or not ultimately to persuade, but to perceive on every subject what is adapted to procure persuasion. What in it can you get on that subject that will make it possible to move people to a different position? And for Aristotle, this means that you should, hopefully, be doing it for the purpose of what is good. So it's an interesting distinction, and it's an important one. He also says, this is on page 165, he says, though we should possess, this is at the very bottom of the page, about 7 lines up, though we should possess the most accurate science, and by science here, he means systematic reasoning, facts, demonstrations. Science here means essentially kind of knowledge and a way of proceeding. It comes from the Latin meaning to know. It is not easy when we speak to persuade some persons by employing that science. For a scientific oration, meaning a highly systematic, highly logical oration, proceeds from discipline, and it is impossible from this to persuade the unlearned, but it is necessary when addressing these to procure credibility and frame arguments from such things as are common. And say, oh gosh, this is not a world of pure learning and pure ethics. No, it's not. It's a different kind of world. So occasionally you will hear commentators on television talk about voters. And they will use the phrase, and they will try to be very soft in using it. They won't use it in a derogatory tone, but they will use the phrase low information voters. What does that phrase mean? It's used. Seth? Are you a government concentrator? Yes.
Low information voters are voters that don't really research the candidates beforehand. They just kind of vote on optics.
Optics. What do you mean by optics?
So sometimes they'll vote on, say, if a candidate looks more confident or based on things that aren't exactly policy related or position related.
Yeah. Yeah, the perception. It actually can have to do with personal appearance. It can have to do with the way someone speaks. It doesn't necessarily have to do with the content even of what they say. And this also means that, low information voters may be people, they don't read a lot. They don't listen to news much. They're not informed about the issues. They've registered to vote. Do they have a right to vote every bit as much as anyone else? Of course they do. Are you going to have to persuade them if you want their vote? Yeah. Of course you are. So what Aristotle is saying is that when you address a larger audience, you have this issue that you are not dealing with someone who is a perfectly informed, absolutely pure reasoner. You may be dealing with someone who doesn't have a lot of information. We select juries in this country, right? We select juries. And when we select juries, do we just take the first 12 people? No, we don't. You get a pool, and then very often in a jury trial, what happens to that pool? How does it get narrowed down? Yeah.
You go through jury selection, voir dire?
Yeah, voir dire, jury selection. You ask questions, people answer them. They've already filled out a form. And very often, a lawyer will say, well, we don't want so-and-so. And in certain cases, under certain state laws, for example, a lawyer or a prosecutor might have a certain number of jurors that they can reject without giving an explanation. They just say, I reject juror A, I reject juror B. Sometimes there's a limit to how many you can do that to. Now, why would lawyers do that?
Well, they're trying to stack a jury that's going to be sympathetic.
Ooh, stack. Ooh, that's, stack a jury.
Create a jury
Create
that's
a
going
jury,
to be
yes.
sympathetic to the
Yes,
case.
they're trying to create, that's their job. And in fact, they may even hire a jury consultant. There are whole people whose whole careers are devoted to being jury consultants in order to get a certain profile that they hope will be good. Now, you say, oh boy, that doesn't seem very fair, does it? But what arguably makes it fair? Both sides, right. It's an adversarial process. Both sides get to do this. And the result is a jury that both sides, in one way or another, are satisfied with according to the rules of the court. May not be their ideal jury. Almost certainly is not. But so this is in part what Aristotle is getting at. Your audience is very complex. It's not ideal. It can't be ideal. It's going to have different levels of information and may indeed have different levels of feeling. So take a look then at page 162, please. I want to point out a couple of other things. At the bottom of that page, Aristotle says what I've mentioned before, which is that rhetoric is both systematic in the sense that we learn things like syllogisms or fallacies or parts of an oration. We learn these elements of rhetoric, but it is also artistic because in any given situation, you're going to have to come up with an argument. And it's an argument that cannot be previously formulated. It's going to have to come out of the particulars of the case in front of you. And as Aristotle says elsewhere, the particulars are infinite. Every situation differs. Every law passed looks at particulars that have occurred. Every state in this country has different laws. We all think about the Supreme Court or federal law, but the vast majority of legal cases in this country are carried out in state courts. And states do not have the same constitutions. They do not have the same laws. They do not have the same sentencing guidelines. They may look at other states and compare, but all of those particulars differ to some degree from one state to another. So you can't go in, for example, and argue in one state a case the way that you would argue it in another state. Matter of fact, one of the reasons you couldn't do it is because if you're a lawyer licensed in New York but not in Nebraska, can you practice in Nebraska? No, you can't. Why not? You didn't pass their bar exam. You don't know their state law. You don't understand the particulars that you have to deal with. So every single rhetorical case particularly that's forensic or deliberative has to take into account all of the possible particulars. It is especially requisite, therefore, that laws which are rightly framed should define all such particulars as can be defined, and leave very little to be defined by the judge. It's not always true. You can make a big effort to do it, but it's hard to do. You write a law in which everything is crystal clear. We all know that doesn't always happen. It's very hard for it to happen. So, to what is it that we are, in a sense, committed? Aristotle says on page 165, again, this is in the last paragraph, rhetoric is useful because things are just, things true and just, are naturally more excellent than their contraries. And there he's putting his ethical cards on the table. He is saying rhetoric is useful because things true and just are naturally more excellent than their contraries. You want things that are true and just to prevail, and rhetoric is useful in doing that. So that unless judgments are formed according to what is fit, what is more excellent will be vanquished by its contrary, and this is a thing worthy of reprehension. So we mentioned this before. If in debate, if in policy, if in a courtroom, if in interpreting a text, you don't use all of the rhetorical tools available to you, and you're arguing something against someone, or even if it isn't against, something different than someone else, what will someone else do? They will use all of those tools. They will. So in other words, once you get in the game, once you're down in the arena, once you're on the court, once you're in competition, you have no choice but to try to use what is available at your disposal. Because if you don't, someone else will. There's no doubt about that. And they will win, and you will lose. And what you had hoped would be better may not come about. And now you may say, well, this is a cynical view of the way human beings work. No, I don't think it's cynical at all. I think this is the way things often get pounded out in debate, in discussion, and in an attempt rhetorically to present and to create credibility. So it's interesting to me that here in this brief statement, Aristotle is putting his cards down on the side of what he considers to be true and just. That there is a moral quality to rhetoric well practiced. It does matter. Despite what his teacher Plato had said about rhetoric, despite what Immanuel Kant, the philosopher, said about rhetoric, or Thomas Hobbes, or many others, they said things about rhetoric which were not perfectly complementary. Why? Because rhetoric is not a closed and perfect system of moral reasoning. It simply isn't. It's not intended to be. It's not like John Rawls' theory of justice. It isn't. It's something different. It's a pragmatic approach. And it means to some degree, conforming with the audience and recognizing its mixture of feelings and prejudices. This is what Campbell says. It means recognizing their moral feelings, or what Farrell, in that optional reading I gave you, called morally significant emotions. Emotions by which people basically make ethical decisions. But not conforming to your audience exactly. Because if you conform to your audience exactly, you're not persuading them of anything that's credible. You're just going along with them. You're not leading any longer. You're simply being a figurehead of a mass movement. You're not taking that movement anywhere. So Aristotle suggests that these views have to be tested. The speaker and the audience both become moral agents. and the speaker is trying to get the audience to become a moral agent in a certain direction. It has to be participatory. This is why John Quincy Adams makes such a big deal of studying rhetoric in a democracy. It's got to be participatory. Everyone can or should be called into involving themselves in decisions that are public and that have to do with the consent of the governed. So in complex situations, we rarely can calculate or demonstrate through one self-evident premise or one clearly factual one. Arguments will always depend on complex conditions and probabilities. They will depend on probabilities, and that means they will depend on judgment. And these conditions have individual valences that we cannot know definitely and simultaneously. So for example, you ever arguing with someone and you or the person you're arguing with uses the phrase, "that depends"? Sure. That depends on whether something happens or not. And we don't know whether something will happen or not. Will North Korea lob artillery shells into Seoul if pressure is put on North Korea and a lot of countries demand that they get rid of their prison camps and put more economic sanctions on them? I don't know. I hope not. I doubt it, but I can't say with certainty that that will not happen. It's a matter of probability and contingency. In the end, the audience's credibility needs to conform to some degree with where the speaker has led them. That's important. And all of these words I'm going to read now, which are part of debate, part of rhetorical procedure, all have a common prefix: concede, concession, community, concern, concur, conciliate, condemn, conduct, condition. What's the commonality there? Con. What does it mean? What force does it carry? Togetherness. Yes. Compromise. That ultimately becomes an aim. It's a very important one. It won't be perfect. Very rarely will you ever come away from a brilliant rhetorical performance saying to yourself, "That was perfect, and now the solution will be perfect." Don't forget that phrase in the Constitution, "in order to form a more perfect union." Yes? Aristotle says something else. I'm going to close with this. This is all the way on page 179. I want to stress it because it casts a light back on what we've been talking about the entire term and the nature, the overall nature of rhetoric. This is about 4 lines from the top of that page. He says, "In proportion, however, as anyone endeavors to discuss either dialectic or rhetoric, not as powers, but as sciences, meaning as ways of proceeding, as ways of knowing, so far he ignorantly destroys the nature of them, by migrating through this attempt into the sciences of certain subject things, instead of alone making a transition into the powers or faculties of words." Now that sentence bears repeating a couple of times and bears your reading it silently. But let me suggest a way to think about it. When you study rhetoric as applied, say, to government, you are not studying government as rhetoric, but rather rhetoric, the powers or faculties of words, as one means, and a very large means, of government. That is to say, they are a means of governing, a direct power of governing. They're not government itself. When you study religion or theology and couple with it rhetoric, say as a form of interpreting something and trying to get your audience to accept that interpretation, or when you study law and rhetoric, You are not studying religion as rhetoric or law as rhetoric. Rather, you're examining rhetoric as it may be exerted on, in, and through the materials of religion or law. Through those materials and subject matter, through the power of language and words. That's the real subject matter, and that's one of the reasons why we will take up topics next time, because topics are formulas of words that permit a certain kind of thinking. And once you study them, I bet you will start identifying topics in so much of what you read. Say, oh, that's a topic. That's a topic. And we'll start to do that next time when we look at Patrick Henry and James Madison on the debates of the Constitution.